friends. Glad you're joining us. We are trying something new here. We're at Lansdowne Alliance Church in our sanctuary. My name is Jeff. This is Bob. We're going to get to some more introductions in just a minute, but we're calling this the Pastor and the Professor because I'm a pastor and Bob has been a professor, and so we just thought this would be a good way for us to have some discussions where we think we want to cover topics that we think people are interested in, particularly around the church and God and Christianity, and maybe even touch on some cultural things. And so that's what this is. Today we just wanted to give you an introduction of who we are and why we think you should care about this and why we think you'd be interested in this. And then at the end of our video today, we're going to give you just a very short kind of micro version of what we hope to do in these videos. And so I'm going to start off by asking Bob just to give an introduction of himself, his kind of personal info, some education background, then I'll do the same, and then we'll kind of move into some questions for the both of us. So Bob?
Okay, thanks, Jeff. The first thing I want to say is I'm not a professor. I'm what you call an adjunct. An adjunct is a part-time teaching professor. You could call me a professor. It's an adjunct professor. And I teach part-time at Denver Seminary. My background is I grew up in this church, so I have a lot of familiarity with the way it's worked over the years, over the decades, I should say. And it was in this church that I became a Christian. And I went on to further my education. Around high school, I decided I wanted to do some kind of ministry, so I went to Nyack College, Lyons College, and studied theology and then philosophy. I didn't finish there. I finished up at Towson University. And then I went on and I got married and worked for the railroad for about 20 years, and then I worked in consulting for 20 years. But over that course of time, I picked up some educational training in theology and biblical studies. So I'm a graduate of St. Mary's Seminary. I'm a graduate of the Graduate Theological Foundation. I have a PhD from that. And I am currently studying with Northern Seminary, picking up some additional courses. One of the things I've found in education and in the educational field is you always have to keep fine-tuning what you're doing. And theology and biblical studies moves very rapidly. I'm a member of the Society for Biblical Literature and the Evangelical Theological Society, and also the Society for Biblical Research, or the Institute of Biblical Research. So I've presented at Society for Biblical Literature this past year, actually twice, and I've done a presentation for the regional, both regionally and nationally, and I've also done a presentation for the Evangelical Theological Society. So I'm saying all that just to say, while I'm not a professor per se, I'm not a full-time teacher at any college, I do try to keep myself attuned to what's going on in the world of the Bible and the world of theology. So I'll turn it back over to you.
And the world of scholarship.
And the world of scholarship.
And really the reason I picked professor and the pastor is because I am a pastor and I like things to alliterate. So we had to say professor instead of scholar. But that would have worked. Or doctor, because Bob is a doctor. So I just asked Bob to share that, just to share with you, highly qualified to talk about things that have to do with theology and the church. And maybe you're like an average layperson and you're thinking like, theology, why does that matter? But the reality is you do theology all the time. You just might not know the technical lingo for it. And so I thought it'd be really fun to talk to Bob about that. And so I'm the pastor of this church. We're located just outside of Baltimore in Lansdowne. So we're Lansdowne Alliance Church. We're part of a bigger family of churches called the Christian and Missionary Alliance, or the Alliance for short. I'm a dad. I'm a husband. I have 2 little kids. Bob, you have a family as well. So we're while we have these official capacities in our church or in our field of education, we're also just regular people who go to church and we have families. And so we're interested in these issues from those perspectives as well. My education level is just undergrad. I just have a bachelor's degree from a Bible college, a great Bible college that trained me really well, I think. But I don't have any of that secondary education. And so as we go into this, what I've noticed when Bob and I talk is I will ask Bob a question and he oftentimes will respond with, well, the scholarship has kind of moved past that already. And so I may be able to relate to the person who hasn't been in that world of scholarship. And then Bob is able to come and say, well, here's where the scholars actually are now, and help us to understand and think about things in a way that's really helpful. Because I know that we've had tons of these kind of conversations, like at Panera Bread, which is where we tend to end up. And I thought this would be a great format to do this, to kind of bring you into that, either online or people who are here in person. So that kind of leads me to the next question that we wanted to cover today is like, why do we want to do this? Why did we think this was a good idea? Why don't you go first?
Well, I think it's important to kind of take a hard look at topics, particularly topics that come from the Bible, topics that you hear from the pulpit, or from just generally being a Christian. You'll have people say, well, this is what we believe. But when I say that scholarship has moved past that, there are certain categories that we have in the Protestant church, and even between Protestants, Eastern Orthodox, and Roman Catholics, where there are certain topic areas where we will disagree, and we may agree in certain areas, and we say, well, I agree with this part, but I don't agree with that. But the main thing is, the fundamental question that everybody should be raising as a Christian is, what does the Bible teach us about this topic? What does the Bible teach us about everyday life? I mean, we're in the middle of an invasion of the Ukraine by Russia. Is there something in the Bible that teaches us about that? But in your everyday life, why does God bring certain things into my life when I don't want those things in my life? Or, why am I getting blessed so much and I see this poor guy out on the street who is hungry and needs to be fed? Well, maybe God's blessing you because you're his instrument in order to provide that for somebody. So those are the types of things that I think we need to cover as a church, because the church needs to be the hands and the eyes and the ears of Christ in this world. We need to be able to respond to do that. We need to know, well, what is it that the Bible's teaching us?
Yeah, and I would say as the pastor of the church, my main reason for doing this is because I see a need right now for some more kind of class type things. There's interest, there's a level of kind of desire among our church. And so I thought that this format would be a way that we could sort of do this in a way that maybe would attract people who are not currently part of our church to take interest in what we're talking about. Because I notice that people have questions about things that we actually care about in the church, and sometimes they don't know that we talk about these things in the church. And so I thought this format of kind of doing this online and in person and putting it out there might help people understand that, hey, this is stuff that matters to us as Christians as well. And then as the pastor of the people in this church, I want the people in this church not to be dependent on me or any other teacher to be able to think and feel, not only have right thoughts, but right feelings about God and their relationship to Jesus. And so for me, that was part of the motivation here, I'm hoping that these conversations give people tools and frameworks to be able to think and deal with issues themselves, and not just what does the pastor say about this, because 30 minutes on a Sunday is not necessarily going to accomplish that in the way that it most fully could be accomplished. So that's kind of my motivation for this. The next thing we wanted to talk about was just, what can the viewer expect? What would you say to that?
Well, I think the way what you should be expecting when we respond to questions and when we get questions and tackle topics is, I don't view myself as a theologian. I view myself as an exegete, a biblical scholar who studies the scriptures to say this is what the scriptures say. And that means there may be questions that are not directly in the Bible. Mm-hmm. Now, that's not to say I don't know theology. I taught theology for Nyack College in their undergrad setting back in about 20 years ago, a little bit less than that. But my focus has always been, what does the Bible teach? And that's why I've studied the languages, I've studied the Word, I've written on it. So what you should expect from me is, when a question is posed, if I need to answer theologically, I will. But primarily, the way I try to answer questions is, what does the Bible say about this topic? And I know eventually we're going to tackle the baptism question. Mm-hmm. I'm going to be looking at, what does the Scripture say? So those are the things that you should expect from my side of it. if there is a direct theological question that you have, we can answer that. That's not a problem. But I think what we want to say is, if I were listening to the words of Jesus or the words of Paul, how would Paul or Jesus be approaching this? How would Peter be approaching it, or James, or John? So that's what you should expect from me. I'm going to be take the approach more of a biblical scholar as opposed to the theologian, and they are separate fields.
I think for me, what you can expect is, the same thing. I want to go back to the Bible, obviously, but Bob has more tools in his tool belt to go there than I do, and so for me, that's a main concern. But also, just my thought as a pastor is, how is this going to affect you and apply to you tomorrow morning when you go into work, or in your family, or when you're at home cleaning the kitchen and you're with your family or you're with your friends? So that's kind of where my angle, and I think the two of us would work together great in that. And so the other parts of it that you can expect just technically is, we're going to keep these sessions between 30 and 60 minutes. Some of them will be a little longer than others. There's going to be both an in-person and an online version of this. So today we're just doing this online to get kind of an introductory video out there, but we're hoping that you'll join us in person for it, because part of what we want to do is have an interactive time where we can have live questions from whoever's here in the room, but also we have set up live texting questions where you can text in anonymously questions to us, and I'll get them right here on my phone, and if we find one that's really helpful or something that we want to cover, then we'll answer that question. So we plan on having a segment during every session where we're going to do some live Q&A to try to keep it really interactive, because that's the thing that I think people are most interested in.
When we answer a question, it's our perspective of what that topic means.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean that that's the only answer you're going to hear if you go out and talk to another pastor, another theologian, or another biblical scholar. You're going to hear answers based on our understanding of the question and the topic. Baptism's a good example. If you were to ask a Roman Catholic, why do you baptize babies? If you ask me that, we don't baptize babies.
And we have a reason for that.
Right. And there's a difference in how we view baptism. It doesn't mean that they're wrong and we're right, but we have a different perspective on what baptism does.
Yeah.
So those are the types of things that we're going to try to at least touch on, and we will talk probably about the different views. But at the same time, there's a bit of ad hoc here, and there's a bit of personal opinion, and you need to understand that that's kind of the nature of what theology and any kind of topic area is going to be.
What we want to do to kind of wrap this video up is give you just a little snippet of an example. Our first session is going to be on the topic of baptism. There's an article that came out recently of a Roman Catholic priest in Texas who was literally saying one word wrong as he was baptizing people, and for the Catholic Church, that invalidated those baptisms. And so we want to I've had 5 or 6 people ask me about this article that came out, and so I thought, man, this would be an enticing first question. But for today, we want to just give you an idea of what you've already seen the way we kind of banter back and forth, but we want to kind of answer a question that we got a while ago as part of a survey we did at our church. We're recording this in the middle of March 2022, and so for the last few weeks, there's been a full-scale military invasion by Russia into Ukraine, and that's a whole big conversation. But a couple weeks ago, Bob, I heard a pastor talking about these two guys, Gog and Magog, and they're these kings, and are they symbolic for world leaders in the future? And then there's this idea of Russia being in the Bible and coming down from the north to invade Israel, and is that Putin's plan? And so there's all this conversation, especially in sort of the American evangelical church, about whether or not this is the end times, and whether or not, this is sort of playing out in front of our times, or in front of our eyes. And I think for me as a pastor, what I see is a lot of fear and a lot of kind of nervousness about it. And so what are your thoughts on that?
That's a really good question. I've been in this church for quite a while. I've been a Christian for almost 60 years now. I was raised in a Christian household, but it was, I grew up in the time, in the 60s and 70s, the time of civil rights, the time of the Vietnam War, and in the 70s, the time of the Jesus movement. And during that time, there were books published, and people believed that we were in the end times. Mm-hmm. And it's now 50 years later, and the same dialogue is going on, or the same monologue is going on, where people are saying, I'm looking at this in the Bible, I'm looking at this now today, and it looks like this end times. Well, the Russian invasion of the Ukraine is simply that. It's evil. It's a Russian invasion of the Ukraine. It's based on, in my opinion, it's based on lies that are being propagated. And we're getting a lot of that in the news now. Mm-hmm. I don't necessarily see this as the end times. I think we're always in the end times. Ever since the resurrection of Christ, there is a new era that has occurred. And it is the time when the church embodies Christ for the world. Mm-hmm. Things are going to take place during this time. Growing up in the 60s and 70s, we thought we were in the end times because we were in the nuclear age. We were hiding. When I was a kid, we were hiding under the desk at school because a launch of a nuclear device was imminent. So there is always this sense of tension in the world where when things occur, the question comes up, is this the time of the return? Yep. Well, the time of return is always imminent, but it's always something that we expect, and it is a doctrine of the church that Christ will come back. We believe that, and we believe that there is a full redemption, not just of humanity, but of the world. So we need to be willing to always be looking and anxious for that. But this particular invasion seems to me very much like a lot of other ones that have occurred through history, where conquerors come in and try to expand their empire. And this is empire building. We need to realize this. And in Putin's case, I think what he's trying to do is restore what he saw as the Soviet or as the Russian Empire, which was the Soviet Union.
Right.
So I'm not saying that this is not absolutely not a sign. What I'm saying is that we should take these things for what they are. They are evil events, and as the church, we need to speak out against them. And if it coincides with the return of Christ, that would be wonderful. But I don't necessarily think we should be looking for the next step in that, because I don't know that those steps necessarily are going to occur the way we think they're going to occur.
Yeah, I mean, the question of, is this the end times and will it all be Armageddon? It's, to me, kind of a category mistake of a question. It's not really the question that we should be asking. Two passages came to mind as you were sharing. The very end of the Bible, the prayer of the church, or the prayer the last words you see in the Bible before the final little greeting is, "Come, Lord Jesus." And that's our heartbeat. That's our desire. We want Jesus to come. And then I think of 2 Peter 3, where he lays out sort of this apocalyptic view of what's going to happen. The skies are swallowed up, and he says, what sort of lives ought we to live in holiness and godliness? And so to me, that's kind of the response. Is this the end times? It might be. Like you said, it's been the end times for a couple thousand years.
Right.
And how should we live? Well, the Bible's real clear. Be holy and be godly and be expectant, and that's it. And not live a fearful existence because war is happening, because war, frankly, has always happened. And it will continue to happen until Jesus returns. And so as Christians, we live holy lives, we live godly lives. As much as it depends on us, we live at peace with everyone. We want justice and peace, but we're not afraid of the end of things.
At the same time, pray for the Ukrainians. Be willing to support where you can, particularly with people that are suffering, no matter where they are. But Ukraine's in the forefront these days. And be willing to stand and say, this is what is right, because that's what we, as Christians, we are the embodiment of the Spirit of Christ. So be willing to do that. If Christ should come, it would be great.
It would be great.
It would be that simple.
We all look for it.
But I don't necessarily think this is the particular prophecies or statements about Gog and Magog. I think this is just one of the current evils of the world.
I think one of the things to close this out is just to say, if somebody tells you for certain that this is definitely going to be the end times and this is a sign and then this is going to happen, you should not trust that person. And you should not listen to their words, because Jesus himself said, nobody knows the hour or the time or the day. There's just signs, but we've had signs for a long time. So live those lives of holiness and godliness. So our first session, our first official session, somewhere between 30 and 60 minutes, is going to be on Friday night, March 25th. It's going to start at 7 o'clock right here in this same room. That's why we set up in here. And it will be in person. So you come in person, we'll probably have some coffee and some water and stuff, and we will sit in here and have a discussion up front, and then it'll also be online. So those of you who are watching this video, we will also be online for that evening as well, and that will happen through our church's website, lansdowne.church. And so you'll be able to click on that link right on the website that says Watch Online, and it'll take you right to the page for that. And then during that session, you'll be able to ask text questions, either from in the room or as you're online, and we'll get those live. And so the topic for discussion that night is going to be baptism. What's the nature of baptism? Why do we, as kind of Protestant evangelical Christians, differ from Roman Catholics and what they think about it? And we'll talk about the article that sort of sparked all this. So I want to say thanks for joining us and watching this, and we hope to see you March 25th at 7 o'clock, either in person here in this room or online.